I think he's a very brilliant designer of buildings. And what is intriguing is that his most known operations, which has been his concern with teaching and with the research on the Ulster problem, and then followed by the exhibition with Rosalie called Space 1,000 Words, which I think will be seen in the next few years as a very pivotal kind of exhibition, a very important exhibition historically. And subsequently spending sort of half his time in New York and half his time in London and the other non-existent half of his time somewhere in Paris, recently reappearing as the designer of buildings in the recent Paris Abattoir competition. And so it is with considerable expectation. I can't imagine what he's going to talk about this evening. Is he going to wear his polemicist hat, his sort of very young father figure to the English conceptual architecture scene hat, or is he going to wear his architect as designer of buildings hat? And he's one of the people I respect most on the English scene, and one of the people who I think has a very interesting view of what is happening both here and in the States and in France. But really, I will state a personal preference, which is that I hope that he is going to, for a while, do some more of his architect as designer of buildings hat, because he's extremely good at it, which is something that perhaps half of you were pretending not to realize.
I must thank Peter for this very flattering introduction. And actually, about 2 days ago, when I was talking with Ron Hara about what I would be talking about, we sort of joked about the fact that perhaps I ought to start the lecture by saying, this is my last lecture. That's the last time I talk, that's the last time I do something which is related to writing. And then I thought that's a bit too pompous and too, in a way, implying that one has sort of rhythm in one's life, which is not untrue in a sense. In the last 7 years, I don't think that I've designed very much, and I've been spending most of my time writing, really, and teaching. So, in a sense, the talk could be either the beginning of another phase or the end of the last phase. I think it will be the end of the last phase, but in a very particular sort of way. It's the first talk I think I give where I use really a lot of slides, and my only worry is that I'll get out of sync. But really, what I'm trying to do with this talk, which is perhaps more theoretical than many of the talks that you've heard in the last few days, and that's perhaps also one of the motivation which sort of made me think, well, let's talk about a problem, a very general problem, rather than, show a series of work and describe them. So, in a sense, the problem I want to talk about could be summarized in what you just heard a while ago, when just before Peter's talk, there was some music in the background, and perhaps some of you have recognized that this music was the beginning of this opera, the Don Giovanni Opera. And why Don Giovanni? That was a strange thing. It came about a few months ago while I was working on a particular article which was making the distinction between what is theater and what is reality, what is true, what is untrue. At the same time, I started to work on that competition for La Villette, which was my first project for a very long time. And there was one fascination which came, perhaps due to the content of the project. Those who saw Korea on Saturday know a bit about the requirements. There was a large park which was required. And at that time, the relationship between park and building, the relationship between reality and what is not, what is built and what is not built, what is grown and what is actually made out of stone, became that sort of very strong focus point, which I thought was very strongly related to one of the overall myths of mankind, i.e. the myth of Don Juan, together with Oedipus, Faust, and so on. So perhaps if I find the thing, I'll very briefly remind you what the myth of Don Juan is, and putting sort of a series of slides that go with it from different periods. In a way, it's a very simple story. Don Juan runs from a sensual adventure to another sensual adventure. And during his sort of amorous enterprises, he kills the father of one of these ladies. And there is a stone figure, which is the stone figure of the father, that reappears throughout the play or throughout the myth. And that stone figure is somehow something that exerts enormous fascination on Don Juan, because he sees an aspect of himself which is not contained in his amorous conquests. And so there are the two phases in the myth. On one hand, seduction, which is followed by murder, and on the other hand, the meeting of Don Juan with the dead, i.e. with that stone figure at the end of the opera, or in the end of the play as it was first historically. So we have those two articulations, but somehow the attitude of Don Juan is exactly the same in both cases, i.e. he attacks both, let's say, the women as a symbol of sensuality or whatever, and the stone figure as a symbol of death and you know, definitive sort of statement in the same sort of way, with a lot of irony. So, in a way, my thought was that there is a parallel, and I'll develop that parallel through the talk, between architecture, as I see it, and that particular myth. In other words, Don Juan as an architect, if I call him an architect, is a sensual and fairly narcissistic figure. For him, love, I mean that's true feeling, does not really exist in a sense. He doesn't love the people for whom he builds. They are only a series of immediate and never to be repeated experiences. You build something, you do something. When it's there, when you go into one particular space that you have built, or even that you visit of somebody else, it is a sensation, but a sensation that you cannot communicate with words, which is quite cut off from the theoretical approach that you had to have before you started to go into the building, i.e. at the time you were designing it. So, Don Juan is that sort of sensual person. He has these senses. At the same time, he's an intellectual. Anything which is not really rational bores him. So, let's say that everything which is there is to be questioned, i.e. the universe is there to be questioned, and he prefers things rather than people. He prefers the geometry of, let's say, of architecture to perhaps its use and its function. But we'll go, a little further on that. So, this is very briefly what I see Don Juan to be about. But let's go back to perhaps a more, let's say, conventional view of, or usual view of architecture. Architecture loves to play on a series of contrasts, something which is formal, something which is informal, and or order versus chaos. Whenever you try to define architecture, there is a whole series of views, and I'm not going to go into that because I'll try, perhaps I'm not the only one, but to get away from any functional or any sort of user-oriented approaches and consider that this is part of the realm of building, and what I'm interested in is that sort of magic thing that could be called architecture, which perhaps goes beyond the realm of building and therefore which is not to be related to something which is very precisely, let's say, definable as a use. So, this, if we talk about definitions, we may talk also about contrast. And there is a thing, again, if I talk about architecture, this game between contrast of, let's say, something which is formal versus something which is informal, something which is regular versus something which is irregular, so the chaos versus the order again. Now, it's easy to quote if you think of L'Abbé d'Augier, which was quoted by Le Corbusier in the 20s, but L'Abbé d'Augier was writing at the end of the 18th century, and was declaring that in architecture you have to have regularity and fantasy, relations and oppositions, and that there are elements which are unexpected that have to enter the scenery and so on. And ending by that quote that you know, order in the details and chaos in the whole. So, in a sense, Laugier was simply announcing something that was very much contained in the whole of the modern movement, and is in some of those slides that you can see. The constant game has been there. Now, in the Don Juan situation, a similar thing happens, i.e. between his fascination for the order as represented by the dead figure of the father. Again, it's interesting that it is a father figure, in other words, something which is a symbol of authority, and, let's say, his more amorous type of life. So, Don Juan, just like architecture, I would say, is dissociating flesh and soul, flesh and geometry, or and intellect. And he's certainly in love, but of bodies, of things which are tangible, not of a feeling, not of love itself. In other words, he's dissociating feelings, sensations, and reason. So, and he adapts to whatever situation there is. But his real love is not that voluptuousness thing. It's something which is very precise. Anything which is not precise bothers him. And his real fascination, I'd say, is geometry. He turns back all the time to this. And in other words, let's say, the role of his role vis-à-vis his clients, or his role or his responsibility vis-à-vis his clients, does not really exist, because he doesn't have to be faithful to them, and he is not. And it's not so much because he's indifferent to them, but because he's afraid to lose himself. In other words, he's afraid of the sensuality, and he's afraid of something that will not be formalized. Now, what's interesting is that the play Don Juan was written at a very particular time. It was written in 1627, and this date coincided on 3 years with the creation of the first school of architecture, the Academy of Architecture, created by Colbert in France. Now, it's a very important date in a sense, because it's the time when the knowledge of architecture is separating from the building itself. It's totally, suddenly, there are different people. There are people who are trained in a school, that use their mind, and people who use their hands, and who receive certain order, and who have to translate in stone what those diagrams may be. In other words, that separation between knowledge and the making of it is, in a sense, something that could characterize Don Juan. Don Juan is not someone who becomes something, you know. For those who know the play, at the beginning of the play, he's already, you know exactly what he is. You don't have a plot where he develops and he changes throughout the whole 2 hours. He remains something which is fairly static. One knows that he'll remain what he is, i.e. this mixture between his view, thought, sensation, and at the same time his love for geometry, until death comes. So, in a sense, there is a parallel that one feels to make when one is sort of handling a play which is fairly Spanish in character, i.e. the notion of a torero and the bull. again, that's the same situation. You know exactly what the outcome is. The outcome is always the same. Even if the torero gets hurt, the bull dies. So what is important is not the death of the bull, but the style with which you kill the bull. And that stylistic notion, it's actually the notion of the victory of the mind, i.e. of the spirit, over, it's a game. And that's what the stadium is looking for. And so it's that game between order and disorder, between the contradictory elements that are, let's say, that is the sort of game that architecture plays with, I think. So, to speak, that game of a language, I could quote Cobb again on his notion that the architect is an acrobat and he's on the tightrope. And he says, look out, he's an acrobat and not a clown. So again, that sort of recurrent thing is fairly obvious. Now, if I move a bit further, simply saying that there are three, let's say, in the play there are three characters, I could say, or three components. One is Don Juan, that sort of very strange and ambiguous figure. Ambiguous in a lot of sense. I think the duality plays the game all the time. He's himself, he acts, he's somebody else. He exchanges costume, he exchanges roles, he's male, he's female. He becomes the stage at the end. So there is that first person. Then there is the whole thing which is represented by his adventures, his sensuality. And then the third one, which is death itself, as a representative of order, of theory, of rule. So between those three components, there's of course a whole series of play, and the whole history of the play, of the various operas that have been written and all that, tend to put more emphasis on one of the three elements, depending on the whim or the wit of the writer. Now, in architecture, the same thing happened in a sense. If I think, for example, of people like Laws, who have been always concerned with an architecture of renunciation, something which was very Puritan. Here, parallel with a restaurant by Mies, which is again that notion of renunciation, return to an anachronic purity, and which is putting the emphasis, let's say, on the stature. Another one that I think actually we're jumping to the next slides, next series of slides. Another one I didn't have any slides of, but I'm thinking of Dada and of this attempt by people like Richter, like Tzara, or like Hugo Ball, to dive into disorder and to laugh at order without any, I think that's very important, to laugh about something without being afraid to be laughed at, which is this ultimate strength. And in a way, so Dada was able to play that. Architecture didn't play along these lines for several reasons, but I think the roots are there very strongly, at least in the modern movements and in its culture. So we've got these three elements. But now I'd like to leave that for a while. I'll come back to all this, and I'd like to take what I could call examples. And I will take only one, which is gardens. And perhaps, or there are very many reasons for that, some which are perfectly circumstantial, but perhaps some which are historical. In the same page, as you know, I started with Logier and his notion of order and chaos. You have to have order in the detail and chaos in the whole, or vice versa. He talks about gardens, and he says something which is quite interesting. He says a city ought to be like a forest, and goes further and says the one who will know how to design a park will have no difficulty to trace a plan or to draw a plan for the construction of the city. So, in other words, is rediscovering something that the Renaissance had discovered already. That somehow I'll pass a few of those, let's say, very, very early garden plans. and then go directly or to the relationship between, let's say, the typical Roman camp with the orchard, for example, or thing. De toute façon, je peux les filer. Sorry. So, now, the next series of slides are simply playing this relationship. At the moment, I will not, I'm sorry if some of them are upside down. There are few theorists who tend to say that the design of gardens have preceded the design of cities in sort of formal aspect. That's probably true with the Renaissance, where you see already the first hint of the formal gardens before the first cities were designed and built. It's more questionable in terms of, let's say, the sort of English picturesque thing. However, there are certain parallels, and you could say that the first agricultural phenomena, i.e. the orchard, was nothing but something that preceded the idea of a Roman military grid, and so on. So there is those, let's say, relationship between here the city of Richelieu, between the garden, and one which interests me quite a lot in sort of historical terms, as one has sort of gone completely away from the idea of Le Corbusier and all that. So one can play and say he was not at all modernistic or whatever. All what he was doing, it was, although he was pretending to be, he was reconnecting with an old tradition, which was the garden design, because between the 3 million inhabitant city and the design of, let's say, certain parts of Versailles, there are enough, let's say, comparisons that may make us think that that particular aspect of rationality is one which is fairly structural in the architectural sort of vocabulary. So in other words, the sort of rational order, which is the one of the movement inside the forest or the diagonal that go through the Renaissance garden and all that, are announcing in many ways things like La Place Vendôme, or you could think of it as a part of Paris with certain of the squares, as for those who know the plans by Pat, which were trying to do very much in this order, a series of open spaces within Paris for Louis XIV. And those who know Camillo's Cité, again, I'm sorry, some slides I couldn't find. So Camillo's Cité also plays in terms of these spaces that lead to other spaces and that are organized in a very formalized way. Those who at Careers talk, I think, have seen some of these influences. So again, called and the relationship with the agricultural orchard, one way or another. So I'll just pass a few. Some strange thing. Oh, sorry. I want to get back. So somehow we have this particular duality or this opposition between what is built and what is not built. It goes a little further. It's also an ambiguity between something which is useful and something which is not useful, something which is for pleasure only, like the garden, and something which is, let's say, we've been all taught that it was for very functional reasons. So, in this respect, this sort of opposition builds up a fairly ambiguous climate, which I think is quite interesting, because if you don't know whether it is a garden or whether it is a building, certain things happen which are not very dissimilar from the thing which is happening in any city today. The whole idea of being able to give a meaning to what you're seeing, I think has gone a long time ago. There is no reason to go on and on particularly, say, semiological approaches. But I find quite interesting that there is no, as opposed to, for example, the little village, a village with 400, I think, sort of the messages are sort of overlaying one another here as well. So that's quite nice. I think the symbol of order as represented by the London police playing just across the road. So, in this sort of ambiguous sort of overlaying or overlapping of different type of messages, the same thing is happening, let's say, in the whole discussion on Don Juan. In other words, there is a mask, you know. You can say that all these messages are just like masks. You have one mask in front of another. And Don Juan, in a sense, has also all these masks, like those overlapping messages. And somehow it is a mask, is a category of the mind, it is a category of the spirit. It's put the emphasis on appearance. And so somehow, whenever you have a mask, you don't give yourself completely to the rest of the world. You just hide somehow, but you hide towards yourself one way or another. And in this respect, one may say that, yes, metropolitan architecture today is having this series of masks. There's no way to represent something which is definitely there. And behind, you have all sort of pulsions, sort of intuitive sort of forces, erotic forces, and all this sort of thing that the more psychological or psychoanalytical approach would discuss. In other words, there is a series of disguises, and I think those disguises are the one that you always end with whenever you start to design something. There's a moment you cannot be entirely sincere. There's a moment when you start to play the games. Now you play the game like when you're an actor, and you act certain things. Like, you know, people like that who are acting. They don't pretend they're doing something particular, they're acting for it. Now, the interesting thing with the actor, if you are, for example, an actor playing Don Juan, then you are acting that you're acting, right? I mean, you are acting in order to seduce that particular person. You're playing that particular mask, but you're also an actor, and you're playing that particular mask of the actor. But every now and then there is a rupture. There is something which is breaking. And you can show it if you want. And the fact of showing it is the start of the play. So, just a few of these are the ones which, in a way, are just as plans of cities. Or other type of ambiguities, which I'll just let them go on very, very briefly, because I'll let, with these two pictures of lumps, Peter develop his particular approach to it in a couple of days' time. So I think that's where I move, yeah. So somehow, again, Don Juan, he disguises himself. It's necessary for anyone who tries to seduce anyone else. Again, when you, as the architect, you try to seduce your client, you try to seduce everybody else. And there are 100 ways to disguise yourself. And these 100 ways, in a sense, those masks are only like the theoretical sign of, you know, your disguise. And take suddenly again playing in the same motive, that in a way architecture becomes like Don Juan. And I think like that the stage set Serlio and his different way to look at different type of moons are not very dissimilar. In a sense, the problem is to have a perfect pretense. It must work very well, and the success is function of the illusion that you produce. In other words, you don't do good architecture with good intentions. A while ago, we were talking about the problem of was it useful in a sense, and what was the difference between something, which is useful and therefore it is a building, and something which is a luxury and which is architecture. Hegel, in a very, I tend to quote him quite often, for a simple reason, is that in a very dogmatic sort of way, he tried to analyze what arts were in his aesthetical treatise, and somehow some of the things that we may disagree with have still a fairly useful sort of, sparring partner quality. And for example, he talks also about gardens. And he says, yes, nothing is more tasteless than something which would be done in such a way that you could see the intention through. At the same time, he says that the garden must be like a sort of laughing ambience, but only as an ambience, so that you can go back to your own interiority. Now, the interesting thing about that interiority is somehow the fact that behind the mask you must be able to do, again, the mask in that particular case, which is an interesting situation of building in front of your series of facade, some sort of a mask which is something else. And in this respect, this type of masks, you see them in the whole of the discussion of Venturi, or of some, for example, of some of the project of Laviletti, when you'll be able to see the whole set. They all tend to play with disguises, up to the disguises which are extremely subtle because they tend to be nothing else but a disguise, like in the case of Belgedes. So, in a way, the seduction of Don Juan is what I would say the seduction of architecture, i.e. In his garden, let's say, in the garden of his conquests. Everything is sort of pure rationality in a way. He relates with things like one relates with the machine. And, but inside, behind the mask, there is something which is burning him in a way. And before he meets the statue, it's very clear that within himself there is a burning question. And that burning question is very much like an example that I like very much, which is the example of the fireworks. In other words, a firework is something which is totally useless. It's something that you do simply for the pleasure. Interesting. If I had known that, I would have prepared it. So, it's something that you do only for the pleasure of it. You do amazing buildings that, or let's say bringing your love for geometry like in that particular case, but for no usefulness. It burns, you can't sell it, you can't buy it. After a few minutes, it's over, and there is nothing that remains, say for photograph. And in this respect, I think that simulates perfectly the quality of architecture as I see it, something that you can't, which is intangible, because it's just that part of it which is useless, and which simulates an enormous amount of energy, but which suddenly breaks apart. So, before, let's say, the disintegration, there is, that ultimate obstacle, which is his meeting with a statue, and therefore, his death. And this meeting with the statue is also the same meaning that you have when you go to a garden. You always get into that stage here around the corner. You go around bushes and toward the lake, and suddenly there is that old stage here, sort of green or still very clean, washed up. And this sort of contradiction, which comes out of itself, which is a sort of metaphor of what you cannot say, because it's just a pure statement in a sense. It could be compared, and here I get perhaps to a theme which is very, let's say, dear to some recent architectural theorists, which is the theme of language. And not language in terms of, let's say, the science of meaning or this sort of thing. It's much more turning, let's say, on probably the generation after the semiological discussion, but the one that sort of looks really at Wittgenstein as in terms of his discussion of language as a prison, i.e. language which you have, which you cannot go beyond language. In a sense, you're completely caught. What I can say with my words, I cannot go out of it. And when I design a building again, I use a series of elements which are there. And the moment when I move away from it is a very strange one, because it's the moment when I move away from language. Of course, the language of architecture is not the same as the language of words. One is more of a catalogue, the other one is a vocabulary. So, in a way, this, let's say, this prison of language that, for those who have read Tafuri, who insist very strongly on the relationship between the, for example, Piranesi, not only the drawing of the prison themselves, which are quite beautiful in the way they play with different spaces, which are really a constant repetition, a rational repetition of elements, but which ultimately lead to irrationality. There's something even more interesting. Again, you'd have to look, let's say, the reference yourself, which is the so-called Campo Marzio. It's an amazing plan that he did of Rome, where he takes all the elements that he can think of, or that he can see, which are part, which are product of the sort of antique architecture, and he combines them as a sort of collage. A collage which is the most rational sort of thing you can think of, i.e. it's one classical element next to another classical element. So you use the most so-called rational object, and again think of the so-called rationalist architecture movement, the tendenza, but use that rationality up to a point, to such excess that it becomes totally rational. In other words, he pushes it so far that these elements that were, quite well selected suddenly become meaningless. And upside down, here, Italian historians will put Aldo Rossi in this particular category. Things which are part of a universe of sign, which are carefully selected, but at the same time, there is one law which dominates, and it's the law of exclusion. So you just try to empty everything of a possible meaning. In other words, everything, is possible, everything can be said. So, in a way, again, it's useless. Just like we were saying with Hegel, that there are technical solutions which are without function. Let's say, we have architecture which is independent from any technicality or any functionality and so on. And so, of course, could it have a symbolical meaning and all that? I won't get into it. I simply let you with those forms which are playing in emptiness. And it's not very far from the language of the, let's say, Russian formalist. You remember that they were saying that the tool of literary criticism is to be found in literature itself and nowhere else, not in sociology, not in psychoanalysis, the very beginning of it, not in politics. It is, let's say, you find in form, the form of vocabulary, you find its criticism within itself. Sorry. same could be said again with the whole discussion of architecture's order and as a particular vocabulary in the case of Durand and all the treaties of modern, let's say, of academic or classical architecture, in a sense. So, in a way, we are brought to the case of saying if there are a series of rules, as represented here, or as represented in the metaphor of Don Juan as a stature, how does one transgress them? What happens? So now the transgression of the rule is an interesting question because here, let's say, in these prisons are to be perhaps compared to something quite contemporary to the Mozart version of the opera, which is when Sade was writing in the Bastille, was writing the different texts, was writing Justine and so on. Sade again is very often quoted by certain architectural historians because the sort of rational component of Sade, the constant repetition, the very precise and very controlled articulation of the different element of the literary progression are such that, in a way, Sade in prison, and that's very different from the Don Juan, let's say, setup, he constructs a very systematic and very destructive piece of work. So the parallel with architecture, with the architectural language, is very clear again. If you have a series of perversions very carefully organized, this is not very far from the discussion that we could have about the Piranesi plan of Rome, or about what certain people give as an interpretation of Aldo Rossi. So in this respect, what I would say differs, let's say, between the Sade discussion and the Don Juan one is the fact that in that particular case, in Sade's case, just as like in Piranesi or in some of the rationalists, the discussion is a very precise one that tries to escape, let's say, from the problem of meaning, from the problem of, let's say, usefulness and all that. And in reality, I would say that if we have words that only refer to themselves, like in the case of of Sade, the book, let's say, or the discussion becomes a philosophical demonstration, and that's very different from, let's say, the Don Juan myth. Let's say the Sade hero never hides his intention. He always says what he's going to do. And you could say the architect is the same. He says what he's going to do. No, it's not quite true. In a sense, he always wears that mask, as we've seen before. And in a sense, the Sade hero has this sort of pedagogical intention. And that's what, could really fascinate me in the work of some of the people, Lancria, that we've seen, is the very strongly pedagogical intention that there is behind the work. And so with the enormous patience, there is an attempt to explain the why of one's acts. Same with the Marquis de Sade. You say why you've done this and that. And between two architecture projects, you never stop explaining what are the reasons, or what is the relationship with institution or with social and political circumstances. Don Juan is very low-key in this respect. He tries to find easy praise. In a way, architecture comes, or let's say his experience of it comes as it arrives. He will not, fight very long for that. So, I think I'll leave it like that actually. So, what do we do now? I'm nearing, let's say, the end of the discussion. If we have a whole series of elements, again, the three that we've described, the stature as representing the architectural order, the sort of perception of space as you can feel it, as represented by that sort of series of adventures. And let's say as a third element, Don Juan the architect. We have, let's say, a sort of, I don't know how you should say that, but a need, to bring them together. Now, in the play, again, in the Don Juan play, at the end, there is that sort of terrifying meeting between the statue and Don Juan, and Don Juan is swallowed by the statue after a festive banquet. And that meeting of the two, let's say, of that universe of sensation, which is fascinated by, let's say, the role of order, by the role of geometry. It is, you might know that Max Frisch, who used to be an architect, wrote a version of Don Juan, which is quite strange and which has a subtitle, Don Juan or the Love for Geometry. Now, but what interests me is again the moment when the two things come together. And it's not so much in the sense, I'll get rid of that, it's not so much in the sense of the man-machine discussion, which I think is extremely interesting, but somehow, I don't know, perhaps this piece behind me is sort of saying it for me, and I won't go on it, I mean, the green piece. So it's not so much in the relationship between, the machine as that thing of order and of, let's say, of rationality, and the body as something of that. It's it's more in something that perhaps I cannot show with any slides, and I'll just put one here, which is the Villa d'Este, that I use as my last slide, which is something that I have to borrow from perhaps a whole discussion which, as far as my knowledge is concerned, was originated by a French writer and philosopher called Georges Bataille, who was completely obsessed by a particular philosophical problem, which is the relationship between the moment of perception and the moment of experience, i.e. if I perceive something, now when do I experience it? Is it at the same moment, or does it go through my mind and does come out, back to my world of experiences? And classical philosophy has always answered that in a very simple way. Spinoza says the concept of dog doesn't bark. He brings a complete separation between the concept and the physical experience. Let's say the concept of space is not in a space. And of course, to say such a thing and to try to bring it in terms of our work, let's say, architectural work, brings a fantastic paradox, which is the paradox that says, if I build something, if I go into a space, if I experience a space, I lose the concept, I lose the theory that went with it. If I work, let's say, on my piece of paper, in a sort of exterritorial fashion, I mean outside the space, if I play with thoughts, I'm not in a space. I mean, I'm not dealing with real space. It's an ideal space. And so one always excludes the other. I have one, but I lose the other, but architecture is the two. So architecture could be defined as an impossibility, as always something which, is lacking, something which is not there, either the theory or, the central experience of space. But of course, that's a very classical interpretation of what architecture is. And that classical interpretation is one that we can question, and we ought to question. And somehow, with the Don Juan myth, I've been trying to put it in another context, i.e. in the context of the play. But the moment when it starts to work, which is that moment when the two things meet together, is what Bataille was calling the moment of eroticism. And for a very simple, let's say, to play a very the common and popular definition of eroticism. It's not the pleasure. Eroticism is not the excess of pleasure, but the pleasure of excess. In other words, bringing that intellectual component in it. So somehow it's the moment when you bring, that thing which is very close to the cold world of death, as again Bataille brings it. In other words, sensuality or eroticism is, let's say, is love without reproduction, i.e. you cannot sort of develop. It has no use. It is only for itself. It is a sensuality of its own. But the intellectuality, let's say, the thinking that goes with it, is really what makes, let's say, the ultimate erotic experience. And in this respect, architecture is very much like that. You always have that thought, that concept, and that experience of space. So I would, for example, totally disagree with Boulez when Boulez says architecture is simply the drawing. Architecture is the production of the mind, and any real building is nothing but a technical translation. I think this is simply putting, all your eggs in one basket and not necessarily the most interesting one. So in this respect, it's at the moment when the two things are together that which cannot be really defined, that the thing exists. Now that's where I get back to the garden. I find the gardens fascinating because they're useless. There's no garden that has, if we go away from the agricultural aspect, if we go away from the, let's say the feeding aspect, then the garden itself is something which is playing with a vocabulary which is not unlike the architectural vocabulary. It's a mixture of reason and a mixture of sort of feelings. And now, you might have noticed that I've never made any difference between so-called classical gardens and picturesque English romantic gardens, for example. I don't think it matters. I think that the difference finally is a secondary one. Some may play, say, that there is a formal vocabulary. Again, the old opposition that I discussed at the very beginning when I said that architecture is always made of these two components. One which is order versus disorder, or regularity, irregularity, and all this sort of thing. And saying, no, I want to get away from that fairly obvious type of, how shall I say, duality or polarity. And, but what's more is that polarity between order and disorder in terms of most architectural history is always a formal polarity, i.e. it's discussing the role of form. And here, again, what one is interested in is, again, something which is experienced versus something which is conceived. The garden is that sort of mixture of the two things. So, as a last sort of slides, the Villa d'Este seems to me quite interesting in this respect. It plays that constantly with a very, very sort of complex series of elements. But I thought I could show only a black and white slide, because perhaps, as we said at the beginning, I'm not far enough to put colors into it. Thank you very much. So if there are questions, I'd be quite glad to answer them either now